There is a specific kind of silence that belongs only to old paper. It is not an empty silence. It is heavy, filled with the ghosts of the hands that turned the pages decades or centuries before mine. I am a bookbinder. My name is Arthur Pendleton, and I spend my days in a stone cottage in the Scottish Highlands, repairing things that have been discarded, torn, or forgotten. I work with bone folders, linen thread, animal glue, and leather. I understand the mechanics of damage. I know exactly how much tension a binding can take before the spine snaps. I know how to stitch something broken back together so that it holds fast. Books make sense to me. They do not change their minds. They do not wake up one morning, look around the quiet life you have built together, and decide that your predictability feels like a cage. My ex-wife did exactly that 4 years ago. She packed her bags on a Tuesday, leaving behind a beautifully worded note that explained how my stillness was suffocating her. She needed motion. She needed noise. She needed a grand adventure, and I was just a man who liked to watch the snow fall while drinking Earl Grey tea. After she left, I sealed the borders of my life. I stopped going to the village pub. I stopped taking commissions that required me to travel to London. I stayed in Glencoe, surrounded by my mountains, my winter storms and my silent broken books, and then Elara Finch moved into the cottage next door. We shared a thick, ancient stone wall, but that was the only thing we had in common. For years, the other side of that wall had been wonderfully empty. In late October, it erupted into sound. Elara was an acoustic composer. She collected sounds for films and documentaries. Within 3 days of her arrival, my carefully curated silence was shattered by the muffled sounds of cello strings, wind chimes, Tibetan singing bowls, and old jazz records played entirely too loud. She was a woman built of warmth and chaos. She left her heavy wooden doors propped open even when the autumn chill was biting. Her garden, once a neat patch of highland grass, immediately became a tangle of mismatched bird feeders and weather vanes. I tried to ignore her. I truly did. But Elara was impossible to ignore. She started knocking on my door during my sacred morning hours. First, it was to borrow a heavy wrench. Then, it was to offer me a plate of warm scones that were slightly burnt on the bottoms. Then, it was simply to ask what kind of bird was making a peculiar noise in the pine trees behind our roofs. She was direct. She looked at me with wide, dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail of my face, like I was a puzzle she was determined to solve. Whenever we spoke over the low stone wall separating our properties, I found myself retreating. I would answer her questions in short, polite sentences, and then I would flee back to the safety of my workshop. I was a man anchored heavily to the ground. She was a woman who lived entirely in the wind. I knew exactly how that story ended, and I had absolutely no intention of letting myself become collateral damage again. But as the deep winter set in, bringing the heavy Scottish snows, a rhythm developed between us. I noticed that she always left her porch light on for me when I walked back from the village market in the dark. I noticed the way she laughed, loud and completely unbothered by who heard it. And I noticed, with a growing sense of dread in my chest, that my quiet house felt entirely too quiet when she was not home. The turning point came on the first Friday in January. It was the kind of blizzard that makes you respect the mountains. The wind was howling down the glen like a wounded animal, throwing hard frozen snow against the thick glass of my windows. The temperature had plummeted well below zero. It was nearly midnight. I was sitting by my fireplace, carefully stitching the spine of an 18th century poetry volume, grateful for the heavy stone walls keeping the violence of the storm outside. My phone vibrated on the wooden table. The screen lit up in the dim room. A text message from Elara. Arthur, I am so sorry. The pipes under my floor just burst. There is freezing water everywhere and I cannot turn the main valve. Please. I did not hesitate. I did not weigh the pros and cons. I simply put down my needle, grabbed my heavy winter coat, a canvas tool bag, and a high-powered flashlight. When I opened my front door, the wind hit me like a physical blow, nearly knocking me backward. The 10 yards between our front doors felt like a mile in the blinding snow. I hammered my fist against her door. She pulled it open almost instantly. She was drenched. Her heavy wool sweater was soaked through, clinging to her frame. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her lips were a terrifying shade of pale blue. She was shivering so violently that her teeth were chattering. It is under the floorboards in the studio, she gasped, stepping back to let me in. My recording equipment. I tried to shut the valve, but it is rusted solid. Show me, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. I followed her down the short hallway into her back room. The sound of rushing water was deafening. A pool of freezing, muddy water was already spreading across the beautiful oak floorboards, creeping dangerously close to a tangled mass of thick electrical cables and soundboards. "Where is the access hatch?" I demanded. She pointed a shaking finger toward a small square cutout in the corner of the room. I dropped to my knees, wedged my fingers into the cold brass ring, and heaved the heavy wooden panel upward. The crawlspace below was practically a freezing underground river. A thick copper pipe had split wide open, spraying a violent jet of ice water directly into the dirt foundation. "I need you to stay up here," I told her, unzipping my coat and throwing it onto a dry chair. "No," she insisted, her voice trembling. "It is too dark down there. You need someone to hold the light." Before I could argue, she grabbed my flashlight and lowered herself into the narrow, freezing space beneath the floor. I swore quietly under my breath and followed her down. The crawl space was agonizingly tight. There was barely enough room for a man my size to maneuver on his hands and knees. The smell of wet earth and freezing rust filled my lungs. The water soaking through my heavy denim jeans was a shocking, blinding kind of cold. "Point the beam at the far corner," I shouted over the noise of the spraying water. "Find the main shut-off valve." Elara crawled ahead of me, the water splashing against her knees. She angled the bright beam of light toward a thick iron pipe protruding from the stone foundation. There was a heavy, circular red handle attached to it. It was completely crusted in decades of orange rust. I dragged myself forward until I was right beside her. The space narrowed drastically near the wall. In order to reach the valve, I had to press myself almost entirely against her. My chest brushed her shoulder. I could feel the violent tremors of her shivering body echoing into my own. The spray from the burst pipe was hitting us both, coating our skin in a layer of freezing mist. I grabbed my heavy pipe wrench from the tool bag, clamped the iron jaws around the base of the red handle, and threw all of my weight into it. The metal groaned, a terrible scraping sound. I adjusted my grip, my knuckles turning white, and pulled with every ounce of strength I had in my freezing arms. With a sharp crack, the rust broke. The red handle turned. Instantly, the violent hiss of the spraying water died down, reducing to a sad, muddy trickle, and then finally stopping altogether. We lay there in the freezing mud, completely exhausted. The silence in the crawl space was sudden and heavy, broken only by the sound of our ragged, desperate breathing. I let the heavy wrench drop into the dirt. I tried to push myself backward, to create some distance between us. But a thick wooden support beam behind my shoulders trapped me in place. I was caged against her. Elara slowly turned her head. The beam of the flashlight dipped, casting wild, dancing shadows across the damp stone walls. In the dim, ambient light, her face was inches from mine. I could see the drops of water clinging to her dark eyelashes. I could feel the rapid rise and fall of her chest against my arm. The freezing air in the tight space suddenly felt entirely too thick, too hot. The scent of her, something like vanilla, rain, and old wood, cut through the smell of the mud. A terrible magnetic gravity settled over us. It was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Every instinct I had spent 4 years burying was suddenly screaming at me to close the final inch between our mouths. My gaze dropped to her lips. I could not stop it. I watched the way she swallowed, the way her breath hitched in her throat. "Arthur," she whispered. Her voice was barely more than a vibration in the dark. "Yes," I answered. The words scraped against my throat. She stared right into my eyes. She did not look away. "Are you trying not to kiss me?" The absolute directness of the question struck me like a physical blow. It ripped the air right out of my lungs. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I could have blamed the adrenaline. I could have blamed the cold, or the fear, or the enclosed space. It would have been the safe thing to do. But Elara was not a woman who deserved safe, half-true answers. "I am trying my absolute hardest not to," I said quietly, the truth heavy and bare between us. "Why?" she asked. "Because I do not do casual things, Elara." I breathed out, the condensation pluming in the air between our faces. "I am a careful man. I mend things that are meant to last for lifetimes. You just got here. You are a storm, figuring out your direction. I will not be a temporary shelter for you to wait out the winter. She stared at me, her eyes searching mine in the dark. The shivering in her body seemed to still for just a moment. Then she slowly lowered the flashlight. "Let us get out of this freezing dirt," she said. The tension followed us out of the crawl space. It clung to us heavier than the wet clothes on our backs. We climbed back into her studio. I helped her mop up the standing water, moving the thick towels across the floor in heavy, silent strokes. Once the equipment was safe, we moved into her living room. The fire in her hearth had died down to glowing orange embers. I built it back up, stacking thick logs of dry birch until a roaring fire pushed the freezing air out of the room. We sat on the thick woven rug in front of the flames. She had changed into dry clothes, a massive, oversized knit sweater that swallowed her hands. I had taken off my ruined shirt, sitting bare-chested in the heat of the fire, a dry wool blanket draped over my shoulders. I poured us both a glass of dark amber whiskey from a bottle on her shelf. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the firelight dance across the stone hearth. "I got an email today," she said suddenly. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual musical cadence. "From Los Angeles." I froze, the glass of whiskey halfway to my mouth. I set it down carefully on the wooden floor. "From the film studio?" "Yes," she said, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. "They want me to be the lead sound designer for a massive science fiction epic. It is a dream contract, Arthur. It is the kind of job that defines a career. More money than I have ever seen, and the director specifically requested me." I stared into the roaring fire. The logs crackled, spitting bright orange sparks against the iron grate. It was exactly what I had feared from the very first day she moved in. She was a bird of paradise. She was meant for massive skies, for bright lights, for a world moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. She was never meant for a quiet, rainy village at the edge of the world. "When do you leave?" I asked. My voice sounded hollow. It sounded like an old church bell with a crack right down the middle. She turned her head to look at me. The firelight flickered across the soft planes of her face. "They want me in California by the 1st of March. "Congratulations, Elara," I said, forcing the words out of my tight throat. "That is a wonderful opportunity. You deserve it." She did not smile. She reached out and placed her small, warm hand over my arm. I flinched slightly at the contact, but I did not pull away. "Arthur, look at me." I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the burning birch logs. "What are we doing?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Since the day I moved into this house, there has been this heavy, invisible string pulled tight between us. You pull away, but you always look back to make sure I am still there. You fix my doors, you walk me home in the dark, you rescue my house in the middle of a blizzard. You look at me like I am something precious, like I am a rare book you want to hold but refuse to open. What are we to each other?" The control I had meticulously maintained for 4 long years finally snapped. It broke clean in half. I shifted my weight, turned toward her, took her face in both of my hands, and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was an apology, a confession, and a surrender all at once. She gasped into my mouth, her hands immediately flying up to tangle in my hair, pulling me closer with a desperate, urgent strength. She tasted like dark whiskey and rain. I kissed her until the howling of the blizzard outside completely disappeared. I kissed her until there was only the heat of the fire, the soft sound of her breathing, and the desperate, anchoring grip of her fingers holding onto my shoulders for one beautiful, blinding minute. I let myself believe that it could be enough, but as her hand slid down to the back of my neck, pulling me deeper into the kiss, a cold, violent rush of memory hit me. I saw my ex-wife packing her leather bags. I heard the bitter, exhausted arguments in the kitchen about my lack of ambition. I felt the suffocating, soul-crushing guilt of holding on to someone who was slowly dying from being kept in one place. I tore myself away. We were both breathing raggedly, our chests heaving. The sudden separation felt like stepping out into the freezing snow all over again. "Arthur?" she whispered, her eyes wide, lips swollen and confused. I rested my forehead heavily against hers. I closed my eyes tightly. I am sorry, I said, my voice thick with a grief I thought I had buried long ago. I cannot do this. Why? What just happened? She reached for my face, but I pulled back completely, standing up and stepping away from the warmth of the fire. You got a massive job offer in Los Angeles, I said, staring at the floorboards. You are going to go. I have not accepted it yet, she said, scrambling to her feet to face me. But you should, I told her, my chest tightening so painfully I could barely draw breath. Elara, listen to me. My marriage ended because the woman I loved felt trapped by the life I gave her. I live a very, very small life. I fix old books. I walk in the mountains. I drink tea. I do not want the noise of a city. I do not want a grand, sweeping adventure across the world. But you do. You are brilliant and loud and full of motion. If I touch you, if I ask you to stay here, in this tiny freezing village, you will eventually resent me for it. You will wake up one day and realize I clipped your wings. And I refuse, I absolutely refuse to be the cage that traps another person I care about. Her dark eyes filled with bright tears. You think you know exactly what I need. You think you can make my choices for me. I know that California is a dream for you, I said, my voice breaking on the final word. And I know that I am just a man who fixed your plumbing. Go to Los Angeles, Elara. I turned my back on her, grabbed my coat and my tool bag from the chair, and walked out her front door. She did not call out. She did not try to stop me. I stepped back out into the freezing, blinding blizzard, walked the 10 yards into my own empty stone cottage, locked the door, and listened to the howling wind for the rest of the long, dark night. I did not sleep for a single second. The next morning, the great storm had finally broken. The highland sky was a sharp, brilliant, aching blue, and the heavy snow blanketed the glen in absolute, blinding white. I was sitting at my wooden workbench, blindly running my thumb over a piece of worn leather. Feeling emptier than I had felt on the day my divorce papers were signed, there was a loud, sharp knock on my door. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and opened it. Elara stood on my porch. She was wearing her heavy winter boots and a bright red scarf. Her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had not slept either. But her jaw was set with a fierce, immovable determination. I called the studio in Los Angeles this morning, she said, her voice ringing clear in the crisp winter air. I gripped the wooden doorframe until my fingers ached. And I told them I wanted the contract, she said. But I also told them that my best acoustic inspiration comes from the isolation of the mountains. I told them I would not relocate. I would do the sound design remotely from my studio in Scotland. Or I would not do the project at all. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. The blood rushed in my ears. You turned down Los Angeles? They agreed to my terms, she said, taking a bold step forward, forcing me to step back as she entered my cottage. She closed the heavy wooden door firmly behind her. Elara, I started, feeling a sudden, terrifying wave of panic rising in my throat. You cannot give up a life in the city for me. I told you last night. I will not let you sacrifice. Stop talking. Arthur, she interrupted, her voice snapping like a dry twig. She walked right up to me, her small index finger jabbing hard into the center of my chest. You do not get to decide what my dreams are. I lived in massive cities for 10 years. I was burned out, exhausted, and desperately lonely in rooms full of people. I moved to Glencoe because I wanted peace. I wanted the snow. I wanted to hear the wind instead of traffic. I chose this place, and I chose this life. Long before I ever met you, I stared down at her, completely and utterly speechless. I am staying here for my own peace. She continued, her voice softening just a fraction, though the intense fire in her eyes remained. I am staying here for my own life. I am not staying for a man. She took a slow, deep breath, and a small, achingly beautiful smile touched the corners of her mouth. But, she added quietly, looking up through her eyelashes, I would very much like to date my stubborn neighbor. If he can stop trying to manage my life and just let me love him. The heavy iron weight that had been sitting on my chest for 4 long years finally, completely fell away. It shattered on the floor between us. I looked at this incredible, vibrant woman standing in my quiet, dusty workshop, bringing noise and color and light into my carefully measured world. I stepped forward and wrapped both of my arms tightly around her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor and pulling her flush against my chest. She let out a soft, bright laugh as I buried my face in the crook of her neck. Inhaling the deep scent of vanilla and winter air, "I promise to stop managing your life," I murmured against her warm skin. "Good," she whispered, wrapping her arms securely around my neck. We took things slowly. We had to. We learned how to gently blend my need for silence with her need for music. We spent our evenings walking along the frozen loch and our mornings drinking hot tea by the roaring fire. 6 months later, when the Highland summer finally turned the glen bright green, we knocked down a section of the ancient stone wall that separated our cottages, permanently combining them into one home. My quiet binding workbench now sat happily across the room from her chaotic, tangled recording studio. The house was constantly filled with the rhythmic sound of heavy paper being stitched, mixed with the beautiful, echoing notes of her cello. One evening in late autumn, the rain was beating gently against the glass windows. I was standing behind her chair, watching her carefully edit an audio track on her computer. I leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to the side of her neck, letting my hands rest gently on her shoulders. She paused her work, leaning her head back against my chest with a soft, happy sigh. She tilted her chin up to look at me, a playful, familiar spark dancing in her dark eyes. "Arthur Pendleton," she murmured, her voice a low, teasing vibration. "Are you trying not to kiss me?" I smiled, dropping my head down to capture her lips. "Not anymore," I said softly against her mouth. "Not ever again."